Antes de mais, agradecer o convite que a Paula fez para vir moderar esta mesa. Eu venho do ativismo. E vamos falar aqui de colaborações. E me desculpem que eu encaro as colaborações do mal de forma equivocada. Aquilo que me interessa a mim, como ativista, eu passo de espera por causa do funcionamento aqui da Traustadóttir. Bom, vamos ver se já funciona. Já funciona? Não? Um, dois, três, vamos falar de frente. Agora, posso continuar a francês? Pronto, eu estava a dizer que so, I was saying that I see this collaboration in a utilitarian way, because what matters to me is to get from the academia. O que importa a mim é, no fundo, escrever os académicos e buscar dados, buscar informação, buscar ferramentas para a luta que nós temos de tratar para o fim da opressão, da segregação, da exclusão que estão sujeitas a pessoas com deficiência. É que, desculpem nesta visão utilitária, mas não o primeiro interesse. Não é? O outro é claro. Todos nós temos interesses intelectuais, académicos, e também gostamos de pensar um bocado. Na mesa, estou aqui a acompanhar por pessoas que estão estas coisas a sério, não eu. Portanto, a partir da minha esquerda, Jorge Manhique, que tem um mestrado em Direito e Política Internacional, a Política Internacional comparada sobre deficiência pela National University of Ireland, tem mais de 8 anos de experiência de trabalho na área dos direitos das pessoas com deficiência. Nos últimos 4 anos, trabalhou para a Disability Rights Fund como Project Officer para a África, no Malawi e no Ruanda, onde prestou apoio técnico às organizações de pessoas com deficiência para implementar a Convenção a nível nacional e local. O Jorge é doutorando no ISCS no âmbito do projeto DER. A sua investigação centra-se na inclusão de pessoas com deficiência em programas de desenvolvimento financiados pela União Europeia. Aqui, mais aqui à minha esquerda, está yes, that's it. Rannveig, o resto, é professora e diretora do Centro de Estudos para a Deficiência da Universidade da Islândia. A maior parte da sua investigação examinou a interseção de deficiência, género e outras categorias de desigualdade. Atualmente, a sua investigação centra-se nas violências contra as mulheres com deficiência, na vida independente, na assistência pessoal e em como a Convenção pode ser usada para promover os direitos humanos e a igualdade das pessoas com deficiência. Rannveig é uma das líderes do desenvolvimento dos estudos sobre a deficiência como disciplina académica nos países nórdicos. Para além do seu trabalho académico, Rannveig tem sido uma defensora ativa dos direitos humanos, em particular dos direitos humanos das pessoas com deficiência. Um dos seus interesses é perceber como o ativismo e a academia podem trabalhar em conjunto na realização de mudanças sociais. E à minha direita temos a Ana Lawson, é professora de Direito da Universidade de Leeds, diretora do Centro Interdisciplinar de Estudos sobre a Ciência e coordenadora do Centro de Estudos sobre a Ciência da Faculdade de Direito da mesma universidade. O seu interesse académico pela ciência e pelo direito tem raízes na sua própria experiência como pessoa com deficiência. Ana Lawson tem trabalhado como pessoa com deficiência, investigadores de diferentes disciplinas e outras pessoas interessadas em lutar contra as persistentes formas de desvantagem e exclusão experimentadas pelas pessoas com deficiência pública. Ocupou cargos de confiança e assessoria em diversas organizações locais, nacionais e internacionais, de pessoas com deficiência e de direitos humanos, e presta aconselhamento regularmente a decisores políticos, governos e organizações intergovernamentais. É também membro adjunto do programa de pós-graduação em estudos críticos sobre deficiência da Universidade de York, Toronto, Canadá. Eu sou Jorge Falcato, sou arquiteto, ativista e sou neste momento o presidente de uma associação que se chama Centro de Vida e Treino. É isto. Iríamos dar início aqui ao nosso debate. Nós, na mesa anterior, tivemos a ver a interdisciplinaridade entre diversos saberes, mas saberes académicos. Claro, nós vamos nesta mesa um bocado ver a colaboração entre diversos saberes, mas saberes académicos e não académicos, o que pode levantar problemas, mas também levanta muitas oportunidades. Eu ia começar por perguntar, eu preparei as minhas perguntas em inglês, não posso fazer as inglês eu ia começar por perguntar a cada um, can you provide, eu ia começar pelo Jorge, can you provide a couple of examples of how you have collaborated with disabled people, individuals or individuals, and other civil society organizations, drawing on our experience of particular projects. I would like to see in practice how it works.
Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado, Jorge. Bom, a experiência que eu vou partilhar aqui hoje é muito ligada ao trabalho que fiz durante os últimos 4 anos, como trabalhando para a Disability Rights Fund e apoiando vários projetos, tanto no Malawi, no Ruanda, no Uganda e também na Nigéria. E por isso vai ser mais uma perspectiva de financiador, de doador, que tem as suas vantagens e as suas desvantagens. Mas, bom, o Disability Rights Fund é um doador único, no sentido em que é um doador que é uma instituição que foi estabelecida especificamente para financiar organizações de pessoas com deficiência, primariamente, e tem um foco muito específico, mesmo dentro das organizações de pessoas com deficiência, um foco muito específico naqueles grupos que são marginalizados mesmo dentro do movimento das pessoas com deficiência. Tem uma grande apetência pelo risco, que significa que não privilegia ideias, então, mais do que, vamos dizer, questões institucionais de consolidação enquanto instituição. Nesse sentido, por exemplo, não financiamos organizações que não tinham experiência, por exemplo, de gestão de recursos financeiros, que surgiram há 2, 3 meses atrás, mas porque tinham boas ideias e porque representavam um grupo que, naquele contexto específico, era um grupo marginalizado. Não tínhamos nenhum problema em dar um voto de confiança e trabalhar com esta organização. E digo que é o único, não há muitos doadores que têm esta potência pelo risco. Nesse sentido, a Disability Rights Fund sua filosofia, como disse, o fundo foi justamente estabelecido pela financiar primariamente organizações de pessoas com deficiência, mas o fundo também privilegia a criação de sinergias entre organizações de pessoas com deficiência e organizações da sociedade civil no geral, que não seja necessariamente de pessoas com deficiência, mas também com instituições de pesquisa. Eu vou dar aqui alguns exemplos. No Malawi, por exemplo, financiamos a organização Umbrella, que chama-se FEDOMA, Federação de Organizações de Pessoas com Deficiência, para trabalhar, para elaborar um relatório alternativo da implementação da Convenção, ou relatório SOM. E neste processo, o FEDOMA entrou numa parceria com a Universidade de Malawi para poder ter assessoria para a elaboração deste relatório. Mas a nossa filosofia é um pouco daquilo que o Marco partilhava com a experiência de trabalho com o IDF esta manhã, é que todos os recursos financeiros, o apoio que nós providenciamos enquanto instituição doadora iam para o FEDOMA, e o FEDOMA tinha o controle destes recursos, sobre como aplicar e por aí fora. Mas trabalhava com a universidade, neste caso a Universidade de Malawi. E nós olhávamos para essa parceria também como uma possibilidade de reforço das capacidades institucionais do FEDOMA, para que no próximo relatório eles eventualmente possam fazer com maior independência e maior autonomia no relatório de jogo. Então, era também uma oportunidade de criação de competências e habilidades. Outro exemplo é de Ruanda, também nos mesmos moldes, mas em vez não foi necessariamente um relatório sobre a implementação da Convenção, mas foi uma pesquisa que a organização Umbrella no Ruanda achou que fosse importante, logo depois da adoção dos Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. A organização Umbrella, que se chama National Union de Ruanda, entrou numa parceria com uma instituição de pesquisa para fazer um relatório, uma análise dos gaps que existem nos programas de desenvolvimento no Ruanda e ver qual é a possibilidade de usar os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável para assegurar de que os programas de desenvolvimento sejam inclusivos às pessoas com deficiência. E foi um projeto bastante útil e bastante relevante, no sentido de que os resultados que esta pesquisa trouxe, Mudo usou para o seu trabalho de advocacia. E conseguiu alguns objetivos, conseguiu alguns progressos, obviamente não conseguiu assegurar que todos as suas recomendações e os seus objetivos fossem alcançados no âmbito da revisão do Programa de Desenvolvimento no Ruanda, mas conseguiu influenciar em determinada medida o processo que estava em curso. Então, o que acho que nestes dois exemplos, uma das coisas que eu penso que jogaram como, vamos dizer, de forma positiva para que os projetos fossem um sucesso foi, como havia dito, que essas organizações tinham um controle sobre os recursos, tinham um controle também sobre, vou colocar entre aspas,
e essas organizações eram dirigidas por pessoas com deficiência.
Exatamente, são organizações de pessoas com deficiência. Estou a falar aqui das organizações Umbrella, das federações do desses países.
É que muitas vezes há organizações que não têm as pessoas com deficiência no poder.
Neste caso são organizações que têm pessoas com deficiência na direção, têm pessoas com deficiência no nível do Estado, têm pessoas com deficiência no nível do voluntariado. Como organização de Angola, nós temos critérios para poder determinar o que é uma relação de pessoas com deficiência integral. E estas encaixavam nessa definição. Mas dizia que um outro fator é que, bom, elas a um certo nível tinham um controle sobre os temas de pesquisa, ou daquilo que eles acham que fosse relevante, mas coloco isto entre aspas, porque obviamente que elas eram constrangidas e eram obrigadas a trabalhar no âmbito do paradigma de direitos humanos, que é o que a DLF pretendia como filosofia e o que usa como filosofia. Em determinados momentos não era necessariamente isso que lhes interessava. Estão mais interessados, como alguém deu aqui um exemplo, com programas de geração de renda por aí fora, mas a DLF não estava interessada nisso. Então, bom, tinham um determinado controle, mas estavam constrangidos em poder determinar o âmbito daquilo que a DLF julgava ser o paradigma dos direitos humanos. Vou parar por aqui.
So, what can you tell us about it?
I have a very long experience of collaborating with disabled people and listening to organizations and individuals and groups. And I'm going to tell you first about my first collaborative research, which was actually in the 80s. And in the 80s, nothing was called inclusive research, emancipatory research did not exist. The only sort of liberating research that had been done was with like Paulo Freire in education, liberating poor people in Global South. So when I started doing my research, there wasn't even very strong disability movement. The disability movement wasn't very strong until sort of in the 80s and became very radical sort of in the 90s in many countries. So the first time I did collaborative research, it was the person, the disabled person who recruited me to work with him. So I was a part of a quite radical Center for Human Policy at Syracuse University. And mostly the center worked with people with intellectual disabilities, who often were called mentally retarded in those days. And they focused, my professors had been activists also, academics and activists fighting against institutions. And many of the PhD thesis in the 70s focused on exposing the institutions. So when I came in 86, there was an interest in doing research about how do people do in a community, like what is their action after they leave the institution. So the center got funded to do what we called the community study. And there was a large group of people working on this study. It was qualitative research, which in those days was really radical. And many journals did not publish this research because it was seen as unscientific, anecdotal, and not really rigorous enough. So things have changed a lot since I started working on disability research. Disability studies did not exist at the time, by the way. They were developed in the 90s. So, back to the late 80s, when, as a part of working with the center, as a PhD student, I took part in a community study. And I was feminist in those days. You still am a feminist, actually.
I was worried.
So I wanted to focus on women. And, I got, the person I was asked to talk to was actually a man. So I was a little disappointed. But, okay. So 70 years in the institution. He was 72 years old when I first met him. And he lived in 3 different institutions. And he had moved like a year or 2 before I met him to a group home for people who were coming out of the institution. And I was supposed to meet him 4 times, sort of to spend time with him and learn what his life was like in the community and write my sort of case study. So that was how much of the research was composed. So we used to collaborate this, and it actually there was a book published from this in I think 94 or something. Okay, so I want to meet this man. He had really significant physical impairments, and he had CP, so it was really hard for him to speak. So it was very hard for me to interview him. So I spent time with him, and he had an assistant from 9 to 3 every day. So I hung out with them and spent time with them. So I called her because he couldn't speak on the phone. And we made, I was going to meet him at his group home, downtown Syracuse. Very shortly after I entered the group home or his apartment, he gave me a paper. It said, my autobiography, and he had, I think, part of his speech therapy and through friends he had in the workers in the institution. He had written about his early life before the institution, why he went into the institution, how he went back home, because he was dying in the institution, he had pneumonia, and so he was sent home. And he was born in 1911. So his life spanned very much the century. And by giving me his autobiography, which was really faded, it was very old, he was trying, I learned like a little later, he was trying to recruit me to help him write his life story. It was such a dramatic thing to meet this man who had been locked up for 70 years, or 60 years, sorry, for 72. He was a lovely person. He had faith in the goodness of human beings. He was not angry, but he felt like his life had been wasted. He never got to have the life he wanted. He wanted to have a wife and a family. He was a really family man. I did not quit meeting him, until he died. I went to his funeral and I cried a lot. I became so fond of this man. We developed such a wonderful friendship. And most people think that, okay, you go out, you have the people decide, but this started as a very traditional qualitative study. It ended very differently because he really recruited me to write his story. And I have written a story, but because he wanted to be sure that I only wrote what he wanted and that his perspective would be clearly represented, he nominated his assistant to read things and make sure that, because I would have written a very, very different history of his life. It was his story. So that was such a learning experience for me, really. At the time, people thought that people with intellectual disabilities could not reflect on their lives, really didn't have a story to tell. It was stupid to try to talk to them because they were stupid and didn't understand things. So, and to write a life history of a man who says like, it was really, it took me a long time to understand it. And also to learn to write his story the way he wanted to tell it. Because, and the reason he wanted his story to be told is that that's the only thing he had to leave behind. His life had been wasted in the institutions. But he wanted his story to be a testimony of how never to treat people. And to start your career with such a dramatic experience, it has affected me till this day. And he, so, you know, his spirit and his life is still with me. And after that, I've done a lot of different research, all kinds of research with disabled people and organizations. And I'll mention another story, another project that, oh yeah, I should also tell you that Tom's story, his name was Tom Allen. I used his story, I had pictures of him and his assistant, and I used his life. I have used it very much in my teaching, in my research courses to tell people how you do life histories. And I've done a lot of life history since then, and I think that's a very valuable, intimate way of doing research with people, where they have, can tell their stories and have their voices heard. Because a lot of the early days in doing doing disability research was what the feminists, we used to call it excavation, is to dig for hidden lives that had not been represented or written about, and voices that had not been heard. So I've done quite a lot of life history work, both with people with intellectual disabilities and with actually the current leader of the largest umbrella organization, disability organization in Iceland. Before she became so the leader, we picked her life history together, so that's also published. But the other study I would like to talk about was the one I mentioned this morning about access to victim support, specialized victim support for women with disabilities who experienced violence. That was a very interesting study that had a very active involvement of disabled women from the very start that the study was articulated. And we applied for it. It was Daphne EU funding, it was 4 academic partners and 2 EPOs that were partners, and many of the researchers were disabled, and some of them were not disabled. And because of this close collaboration with disabled women on the study, I think all of us learned much more than if it had been separate. And from that study, as a result, one of our findings was that disabled women really lacked a safe space to talk to each other about their experiences. That's what we found out in the focus groups that were conducted by disabled women with disabled women. And as a result of that, in Iceland, they established a radical feminist disability advocacy group called Taboo that just really works as a safe space and has actually radicalized a lot of disabled women in Iceland, and they have become well known as strong, very strong voice that irritates actually because they are quite, radical and unreasonable, some people think. So these are 2 examples of very, very, very different research. But I must say that life histories are very close to my heart, and yeah. So,
Anna, your experience.
Like somebody said this morning, that's a very hard act to follow. I'm going to approach this slightly differently and talk about a couple of different types of collaboration that I've had with disabled people's organisations and other civil society organisations, human rights organisations, as a researcher. So the first type is when where I've been commissioned or asked, sometimes ready, to do research for a disabled people's organisation or an organisation. And that's how actually I started working on disability as a research topic. So I was a member of, I was a disabled person myself, and I was a member of an organisation called the Association of Blind and Partially Sighted Teachers and Students, a disabled persons organisation. And they wanted more information and guidance on how the Discrimination Act would affect disabled students. So they asked me to look into that and write some guidance on that for them. I of course researching land law and property law at that point for those who've done all degrees. I think I was ready for a change. And I really loved that. And then the next thing I was asked to do was by the Disability Rights Commission, which was again to look at the same sort of thing, the way disability equality law was being developed in different countries around the world so that we could strengthen the provisions in UK law. And again, I really loved it. I don't want to research on I want to research on disability-related things because it brings my whole life together. What I think is important, and I think is pointed, and I want to spend some time looking at myself. And then that type of research is carried on. So I've been asked to do research by various other organisations, the European Blind Union, as an individual this is, and then I have listed them down, I'm not looking at it. So that type of research is one model, and then the second model, the second type of interaction, collaboration I've had is where I've been, again, a member of organisations, sometimes on the board or the committee, and being involved in overseeing research that organisation is doing, and feeding into it, and bringing academic research into what they're doing. So that's happened with a number of disabled people's organisations, including the Royal National Institute of Blind and Partially Sighted People and the National Federation of Blind and Partially Sighted People. And also Change, which is a human rights organisation for and of people with learning disabilities. And also the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Justice, which is a human rights organisation that focuses on access to justice. And then the third type of collaboration is more the traditional one, where I've actually been involved in designing research projects in collaboration with disabled people's organisations or human rights organisations, and also in overseeing and managing the research projects with them. And then the fourth and final one is where, and I haven't led this has been led by a colleague of mine, but I've been involved in the background. So these are initiatives where we bring disabled people into the university, representatives of disabled people's organisations, people who are activists at a more individual level around disability-related issues. So quite local level, and share research, so share research findings, and then ask them for their ideas about where the research is needed. And that's fed into various bits of research, including a research project which he runs, where students are very involved. And the type of research that students do is often quite different to the type of more academic research that we would propose for funding in corporate things. So, yeah, those are 4 types of collaboration.
Thank you. So, you said a lot of different types of collaboration. At the beginning it was 2, now we have 4. But I would like to know, are there collaborations that are more fruitful? What kind of aspects of kind of factors influence the quality or the result of an investigation? From the point of view of the researchers, what you think, and from the point of view of the PPOs, where what can contribute to be more fruitful, more effective with collaboration? You can start. I see that you want.
I thought you were talking to me.
I see that you wanted to say something.
So, I think trust is a really important factor. And that's linked to another factor, which I think you can treat separately, which is communication. So trust, I think, comes from long-standing relationships as well. So if you've worked with an organisation already for a long time, that itself creates an element of trust, and that really helps with collaborations. But communication is really important. Whether or not you've got that long-standing relationship, communication about the specific project that you're trying to do. The purpose of it, what's it for, what does the and that works both ways. You know, if you're doing it for an organisation, what do they need from it? What's the longer term aim that piece of work is supposed to be contributing to? And what are the audiences that it's intended for? Because that affects how you write, how you present the findings. You can present them in multiple ways. But I think that's a two-way communication, so it's also about communicating to other types of organisation, especially when it's a more academic project, what the limits are on that come with funding very often, that you have to stick to the deliverables, you have to stick to certain types of things that you've committed to. And the pace at which academic work happens as well. So how to communication. And then the last thing for me is really the degree of control and flexibility that you have. And that can be where funders have a big role, because if you're working with very proactive funders, that can have really big advantages, funders that are really invested in the outcome of the research and findings. But it can also, I've had two projects where it's been quite difficult because they've been so involved, they've been changing things as it's gone along, which makes it difficult then, because you lose that clarity of commitment on what was, what you think you can offer to disabled people who participate in the project, if that becomes difficult. Or if the funder doesn't like where the research is going and then wants you to push in a different direction, that can be quite difficult as well. Yeah.
I'll say a little bit more. And when it's suggesting me something, when the collaboration with people with disabilities or people with disability organization takes you to one direction, then the funders will pull.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. I have once felt in a real the phrase piggy in the middle. I don't know whether that's one that translates very well, but yeah, so where strong agendas on both sides. And that can be a very difficult situation.
Okay, I think there are a number of barriers for disabled groups, organizations, and academics to work together. And I mentioned some of them this morning. EPOs, they want and need studies that are more short-term. They map certain practical issues that can reveal injustices, poverty, lack of this or that or the other thing, that they can use for their activism and advocacy and lobbying. And those are really important things to do. However, academics, this kind of research does not really, is not valued in academia. If you are an academic and you want to stay in academia, you have to do in-depth, long-term international collaboration and theoretically rigorous research. So that is not the kind of research that is immediately useful for TPOs. Very few TPOs read what we are required to publish in internationally refereed journals that are not in Icelandic. So to make use of this research in Iceland, in practicality, we have to present it and make it available in very different forms than the university accepts or values. It creates more work for academics to do that. And the university says that this is really, really good because we are working, they say we, those who do this kind of work, we are working closely with the community, we are contributing to education side, but they do not give us any money to do it. So you have to be sort of creative and have a commitment to do this kind of work. And mostly we collaborate with DPOs on research, but not many years ago, most DPOs were not interested in research, really not. They did not see the value of research. That has changed very, very much in maybe it's 20 years. I've been doing research for so long. But I remember when I started to approach the DPOs, many of them were not interested in working with me. Some of them said, oh, you do mostly intellectual disability, at least we are not speaking about it. There were all these kinds of prejudices against me as a researcher who had a lot of commitments to a particular group of disabled people that was sort of low in the hierarchy of disability respect. So I had to overcome that. It took quite a bit of resistance to be accepted by the DPOs. And, earn the trust that Anna talked about, that does not come overnight. You really have to, your hands have to be in it. Nobody can make themselves, if they don't have that fire, you can't do it. So you have to have the commitment, you have to have a passion. I often say, I'm a passionate scholar. I am. I have a lot of fire. Yeah. I have fire. So you have to be passionate about change, social justice. If you work with TPO, it is not an academic requirement, and you only do it if it's your passion to do it. That's really true. So it's my passion, and it's not always easy, but it is extremely rewarding, very rewarding. So I wouldn't have it any otherwise. And we have often come together, the disability studies people, and especially me as their representative, and a number of DPOs, and we have had quite a big influence when we work together. So we had quite a lot of influence, and it was the article Alberto referred to this morning about how we influenced the new legislation to implement the CPD in Iceland. That was an incredibly interesting endeavor for all of us, and we worked together closely, and you cannot work together closely just like this. You have to have a history of trust and knowing each other. And also, if someone does not agree, that you have trust to say, okay, that's fine, you just lobby a little more for this, and that does not destroy the coalition. So a coalition of academics and activists is a really powerful allies. That's my experience, and that's a part of my job that I really enjoy.
Queria dizer que os investigadores na área dos estudos da ciência são investigadores ativistas. Queria dizer, eu tenho a noção de que os estudos da ciência nasceram do ativismo das pessoas com ciência. De maneira que eu gostaria muito que se mantivesse esse ativismo na investigação. Mas há essa condição, de acordo com a Rannveig, tem que haver paixão, tem que haver fogo, terá que haver ativismo para que esta colaboração seja eficaz e resulte eficaz para as pessoas com ciência, para a sua vida, para a qual são estes sujeitos. Agora para Jorge.
Ok. Eu vou responder a questão antes dessa. Depois vou passar para a Rannveig para responder a questão. Bom, só quero acrescentar um ponto, mais uma vez, em relação a que constituir uma boa prática, estimular os processos de colaboração. Penso que, como doador, é muito importante assegurar que haja consistência e um compromisso de financiar a longo termo. Apesar de os seus financiamentos serem anuais, tinha um compromisso para além disso. Não. É para o sul global. Tinha um compromisso de financiar para além do ano. Um exemplo prático é a doutora alternativa no Luanda, que levou 4 anos. Muito aprendizado no meio, coisas que não puderam acontecer, mas levou muito tempo. E encarávamos isso mais uma vez como um processo de construção de habilidades e competências dentro desta tradição. Então acho que é muito importante haver um compromisso de financiamento a longo prazo, não só de um ano. A pesquisa, tanto que se é um meio, não é o fim. As nações vão fazer a pesquisa para poder implementar e fazer a pesquisa, tem que estar nos passos. Em termos de desafios, pela minha experiência, penso que há aqui em termos de do que é que nós consideramos conhecimento, isto já dissemos aqui, há conhecimento das pessoas com deficiência, das suas experiências de vida, é como que secundarizado em função do conhecimento técnico. Se você tem um pesquisador, então este pesquisador é a pessoa que tem conhecimento, que tem um grau, e obviamente isto também impacta. As nossas universidades são bastante orientadas para os graus, e é muito difícil ter uma pessoa com deficiência que vem aqui à universidade, por exemplo, para dar uma aula, e falar da sua experiência. Eu penso que essas são práticas que são bastante importantes e acho que resulta também desta secundarização do conhecimento das pessoas, da experiência de vida das pessoas com deficiência. Acho que este é desafio. E um outro ponto, e o Falcato mencionou isto esta manhã, é que, se não muito bem equacionado, a colaboração na pesquisa pode fomentar ou perpetuar os balanços, como se diz, as injustiças, o desnivelamento em termos de privilégios. Em muitos dos países em que eu trabalhei, o movimento das pessoas com deficiência é dominado por homens e muitas vezes homens com deficiência física, tem poucas organizações de mulheres com deficiência. Existem organizações que nem sequer existem como tal, mas as pessoas com deficiência existem lá, por exemplo, organizações de pessoas com surdo-cegas, organizações de pessoas com deficiência psicossocial. Então, se não muito bem equacionado, isto pode perpetuar este desnivelamento, estas desigualdades. Bom, nós, como doador, porque tínhamos recursos, tínhamos esta consciência, temos este cuidado de assegurar de que o movimento, apesar de que o financiamento vá para a organização Umbrella, mas que a organização Umbrella também faça um esforço para que seja inclusivo o máximo possível, que tome em consideração que existem grupos dentro daquele movimento que não têm uma voz ativa como os outros. Eu acho que é muito importante ter isto em mente. A outra coisa também que está ligada a isto é dos grupos que estão organizados. É muito mais fácil de dialogar com grupos organizados, com grupos que já estão estabelecidos. Mas, mais uma vez, organizações de pessoas, por exemplo, surdo-cegas que não estão organizadas, é muito difícil de tê-las como. E este é um desafio. E ligado a isso também é o reconhecimento. Por exemplo, no Malau, até alguns anos atrás, o albinismo não era considerado como deficiência. E por isso mesmo, dentro do movimento, essas pessoas não eram incluídas nos diálogos. Em Moçambique, só há bem pouco tempo é que surgiu uma organização de pessoas com deficiência psicossocial, mas mesmo dentro do movimento ainda existe uma desconfiança com relação a isso. São pessoas com deficiência, então, são questões que temos que ter em mente, tanto como pesquisadores, como doadores, como pessoas que querem contribuir para, mais uma vez, fomentar pesquisas em colaboração com essas pessoas que precisam.
Mas eu estava a pôr essa questão do envolvimento do investigador, porque eu quando estudei, nós em arquitetura tínhamos as cadeiras de sociologia, e lembro-me que o meu professor de sociologia, que eu mais tarde vou perceber que era um grande idiota, definia a sociologia como que ele achava que era importante pairar por cima na observação dos fenómenos sociais e não tocar sequer, que era para não interferir nos fenómenos sociais. Eu penso que nos disability studies e na questão da participação e da colaboração é o contrário absoluto disto de observar os movimentos sociais e não nos mexer nem com isso. É necessário, é desejável que os investigadores interfiram na realidade social, que provoquem avanços, que, no fundo, esta colaboração que nós estamos aqui a ver entre pessoas com deficiência e investigação é uma colaboração que tem um objetivo, no fundo, de progresso ou é o quê?
Do you want me to ask that? Or comment on? Yeah, well, there's no such thing as objectivity. If you say, well, you know, I'm not interfering, I'm not doing anything about it, I'm just observing, then you are, you know, supporting state support. So there's no such thing as, you know, not being involved. So just by not being involved, you are involved. You are just observing abuse and not doing anything about it, whatever it is. So, I belong to the kind of scholarship coming from like feminist scholarship, and that fits really well with disability studies. You know, my scholarship aims for change, for social justice, for equality. So I have no worries of telling people. And it's like, and I was really fortunate that my main professor, Stephen Taylor, bless his heart, he has passed away, and many other people who were at Syracuse, they, because I came from activism to disability studies, I was really disability studies. Discipline was really coined as a discipline. And I partly did, my minor was in what was called then women's studies at Syracuse, and all of the people I worked with were really activist oriented. They worked for social change. Like Steve Taylor often said, so if it doesn't make any change to disabled people's lives, why do it? You know, what's the point? So I am firmly trained in doing research that makes a difference. And, you know, I don't know how well I would have done with other kinds of professors, but I was really fortunate. But I was really fortunate to be at Syracuse. Others could peek of where these activists were there. They came from the deinstitutionalization movement, and so, yeah, why do it? It doesn't make a difference, really.
Porque há pouco falou-se também de uma questão que é o trabalho político, o trabalho das pessoas com deficiência, das suas da sua vida, que tem um tempo e objetivos diferentes da investigação. Como é que se articula também estes tempos diferentes e objetivos na colaboração entre o investigador e as pessoas com deficiência? E estou a falar neste caso de pessoas com deficiência organizadas para intervir. It's very good. A while ago, Rannveig, she talked about the different times and the positives of the idealism and the research. Now we are talking about common objectives of the social change. How can we balance this two?
I think the fact that the ultimate objectives are shared I think understanding is a deepening of different systems, different ways academia works to have disabled people's organisations. But I think it is a shared commitment to social change that creates things to work together, and that is an incredibly powerful incentive. And as Rannveig said, when we work together and it does work, that's an incredibly powerful force. So that's a really strong motivating factor all around. I don't know. That's a big question.
But in the same direction, according to Colin Barnes, emancipatory research makes the systematic demystification of the structures and processes that produce visibility, as well as the establishment of a viable dialogue between the scientific community and people with disabilities in order to potentiate their emancipation. To make this happen, it is necessary that researchers learn to place their knowledge and skills at the service of people with disabilities. Do you think that you are at the orders of the disability community? Is this against the freedom of research, the freedom of investigation? Doesn't this estrangula ou castra a investigação? Está ao serviço? Isto é sobre
Okay. No, I do not feel castrated.
I think it was frustrating. Was it frustrating?
They're castrated. That's what you said.
Yes. But in a way, in a certain way.
No, actually, I think this we put our knowledge that we gain from research with disabled people at the disposal or make it useful for disabled people. I mean, I think that's our duty because we have earned this knowledge from our collaboration with disabled people. So it's just, I do not think that that puts any strain on researchers. Of course, researchers, no single research project can sort of cater to every need or, be controlled by a disability group. But you learn always a lot of things from doing research, and research findings and knowledge can be shared in different ways. And it's often together with disabled people that we share the knowledge that we have created together. And we often come together to conferences to, we are asked to talk about things, and we present our sort of joint endeavor. I do a more scholarly version, but they do more sort of everyday lived experience version and sort of activist. So I think it works well together, and I do not feel any restraint by having my findings or the knowledge that is co-created with disabled people. I find that incredibly good that it can be used, and I publish a lot in Icelandic in an accessible manner, that in order for anyone who wants to use the research can use it. I always leave all my slides for PPOs to use if they like to, and the government or whoever. So why gain knowledge if you're just going to hoard it? I mean, it's just you want it to be out there. You want it to be used. So no, I do not feel castrated. On the contrary, I feel multiplied.
Because in a certain sense.
I feel
Jorge, sem castrações.
Obrigado. Bom, não tenho muita coisa para acrescentar como disse. Acho que é isso a colaboração. Uma das principais dessas manhã. As pessoas com deficiência, quando participam dessas pesquisas, elas entregam-se, não é? Ao trabalho, colocam-se à disposição. E também é natural que o pesquisador também tenha que fazer isso que vejo os pesquisadores que têm esta coragem de se abrir, de trabalhar com pessoas com licença, têm muito a aprender, não é? Desenvolvem métodos inovadores, tanto do ponto de vista metodológico, mas também com, além disso, da apresentação, dos resultados da pesquisa, quer dizer, tem muito para aprender. Então, é isto que é produção.
Eu quase que acabava aqui, porque a minha última pergunta tinha muito a ver com aquilo que o Jorge disse agora, que é o que é que os investigadores ganham pela colaboração, o que é que as pessoas com ciência ganham pela colaboração, que ganhos existem, de uma parte e de outra, e das coisas. Ana?
So, yeah, I think the benefits go really deep, and for a lot of research without the collaboration, it's not worth doing that research. Because really that research will only have value if it is with the involvement of disabled people and their representative organisations. So it's not a case of even looking at added value, it's looking at any value. Yeah, so there's tremendous, it just goes to the heart of what we're doing. And I think just coming back on the last question to finish, I think it's not just individual academics who need to learn to put their services, or who want to put their services and find ways of putting their research services, making them available to disabled people's organisations. It's also pushing back at the institutional level, so getting the universities to actually value that type of work more than they traditionally have done, and that has changed a bit over time, I think. So there's much more emphasis now on impact, for instance, in UK academia than there used to be, which has changed the value then attached to certain types of research, which is done in partnership with organisations and more community, involving more community outreach. And I know some of the early writings and disability studies were very much expressing frustration at some of the university constraints. So I think there is some pushing back to creating institutional change to create more value and attach more value to the type of work that we value.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I just say that disability studies that do not involve disabled people, that's just plain stupid. I mean, it's just that just doesn't work. I also think that disability activism without sound academic knowledge behind it and information is also plain stupid and doesn't work. So I think we really benefit from collaborating together. I mean, I would not do disability studies unless it was with disabled people, really. I mean, so I think this is a really important partnership between the academia and EPOs or disabled people and disability groups. So yeah, I think I can say this to everything that Anna said. It's just really important, and yeah, it's
ainda temos uma voltinha. Então, quem queira fazer perguntas, lançar provocações.
Olá, novamente. Então, vou lançar aqui algumas pistas e algumas provocações. O Jorge pediu para provocar. Vou deixar a provocação para o fim. Primeira pista importante, da Comissão Europeia, no próximo ciclo de investigação na área da saúde, as associações de doentes e defesa dos doentes vão ser parceiros obrigatórios das candidaturas, vão ser apresentadas à Comissão para a aprovação. Isto significa que as associações de doentes neste momento estão a capacitar-se e a preparar-se com conceitos científicos de maneira a que possam ter a capacidade de acompanhar como parceiros válidos esses projetos de investigação. Estamos a falar de um horizonte de projetos que irão começar em 2021, portanto, há um ano e meio de começar a apresentar as candidaturas. Neste esforço, construirmos o conceito científico, procurámos, junto de cuidadores e de pessoas com esclerose múltipla, gente com treino científico. E Jorge, vou-te dizer que há muitos professores universitários de várias áreas, com vários graus de deficiência, teriam muito gosto de vir falar para os estudantes de doutoramento aqui no vosso programa. Alguns deles nesta universidade, e portanto, vocês depois fazer chegar o contacto desses professores, que com certeza absoluta vos contarão as histórias deles, como é que são capazes de ultrapassar aquilo que são as deficiências que a sua condição leva. Por último, nós temos um desafio, uma provocação. E a provocação é uma provocação para a comunidade de Disabled Advocacy Research. Nós entendemos na esclerose múltipla que para o trabalho analógico, para o trabalho de todos os dias, de levantar caixas, de atender pessoas de pé, de transportar ou conduzir mercadorias, nós temos um handicap que vai progredindo com a doença. Vamos ficando cada vez mais disabled, mais incapazes. Mas entendemos que no mundo do emprego digital, a nossa capacidade de trabalho se mantém estável, se mantém produtiva durante muito mais tempo. Eu acho que esta é uma área de investigação que vale a pena estudar, de que forma é que nós podemos ajudar as pessoas a reorganizar as suas carreiras para o mercado de trabalho digital em vez do mercado de trabalho convencional analógico.
Hello, I'm Han from Manhique. I have 3 questions, so they're quite straightforward. So, thank you very much for the presentation, it was really helpful. And my first 2 questions are for Jorge, because you mentioned that you're as a donor working with the DPOs in African countries. So I'm interested to know that have you ever tried to engage with national local police lawmakers in the process, and how's the experience? Like, is it successful or not? And a follow-up question is that your experience of the advocacy activities you help supported, how are the long-term outcomes? Like, do they how they help DPOs or benefit DPOs in the long term? Like, do they continue their activities after you finish the support, or do they, for example, support other DPOs on the local level in Central? And my last question is for the panel in general. Rannveig mentioned that the disability studies, our researchers should aim to do studies that change people's life, disabled people's life. So usually for researchers, the more obvious outcome or result is usually reflecting policy and law. So I'm wondering, is there any other outcome that you think really change people's lives that is not law or policy, but can you think of any examples that change people's lives in other ways? Thank you.
It's rather speaking. I was wondering, when most of you mentioned that what's most important is to conduct the research which leads eventually to social change. So, do you have any of the examples when you're involving not only DPOs, and not only that the request comes from DPOs, but do you ever involve in this equation the governments or service providers, those who are supposed to effectuate the change? Because if you leave the research results on only the DPOs which don't have enough power to enforce those changes, like how the social change is going to happen. Because if it's not effectively communicated with those third parties and our important allies or the ones who are the end targets for advocacy, how it goes.
Can I start by answering the last question? I just didn't mention it in my talk, but we, every once in a while, not as often as we would like maybe, do research at the request of the Ministry of Welfare, because they do need to know about some areas that they are working on, and we provide them with information. So, yeah, we do not put it on the DPOs to make a change. We work with the DPOs on trying to make social change. So, so we also work with, because disability services in Iceland are decentralized, so it's the municipalities that offer the vast majority of services. So, and the municipalities, some of them are large, like in the capital area, and we work with them, giving information and training for the people who work in disability services. So, and we also do research with them. We do mutual or collaborate on doing small conferences that focus on certain areas like accessibility or children or whatever. So it's that is a misunderstanding if you have understood me, so that I think that the DPOs will do all change. But it's a collaborative collaboration with the DPOs to try to influence the government and the people who have the money. Also, because of Hans' question, I can also say that I did not mean that I wanted to change, I did not say people's lives, did I say that? I work towards social change and social justice. I do not work on changing individual people's lives, that's in their hands. So, one of our most successful ways of influencing what's going on in my home country is that when we came together, the academia and a large number of disability groups to influence the law that implements the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Iceland. So that was a big undertaking that required a lot of work, a lot of collaboration. And now we are struggling for them not to water it down with the next level of rules and regulations to implement the law. So it's not that I work just on, just life histories to change your life or whatever. But these life histories are an example, like Tom's story. Very few people survived the institution for 60 years and lived to tell about it. So he is a spokesperson for a generation that was locked up. And he wants his voice to speak on behalf of all of his friends who died or did not survive, or who could not corner a researcher to help him write the story, that he speaks for a lot of people. So, yeah, so.
Okay. Bom, em relação à primeira pergunta, como doador, nós não engajávamos diretamente não nos engajávamos diretamente com os decisores políticos, os fazedores de políticas destes países. A nossa função é mais de providenciar recursos financeiros e apoio técnico para que organizações de pessoas com deficiência possam interpelar os seus governantes, incluindo os presidentes políticos. Obviamente, nós estamos aí para apoiar, como já disse, financeiramente, tecnicamente, por exemplo, na elaboração de estratégias de advocacia e também ajudar as pessoas com deficiência a encontrar aliados dentro do movimento, dentro da sociedade civil, atores que já têm mais contato, experiência com governantes, para que eles possam fazer a advocacia por eles próprios. Então nós, como doadores, não tínhamos esse trabalho, era mais a um nível de apoio financeiro. Uma parte também do apoio que nós providenciamos é de se conectar as pessoas com deficiência com outros atores desses países, a sociedade civil, mas também doadores, e criar oportunidades para que as organizações de pessoas com deficiência pudessem mostrar o trabalho que estão a fazer em cada país em que a trabalha, organiza anualmente o que chama de Grande Convênio, que é justamente um fórum para as organizações de pessoas com deficiência, não necessariamente aquelas que recebem os fundos, mas toda a comunidade, para que possa partilhar aquilo que está a fazer. E neste fórum convidávamos também doadores e outros grupos da sociedade civil que pudessem, a partir dali, forjar parcerias, por exemplo, que pudessem no futuro trabalhar em forma de parceria ou de coalizão. É mais ou menos em relação à pergunta do Ratos, é mais ou menos a mesma resposta. Como eu disse no início, a Disability Rights Fund privilegia o financiamento primariamente das organizações de pessoas com deficiência. Em nenhuma circunstância dávamos esses apoios a entidades do governo, especificamente para organizações de pessoas com deficiência, e mesmo em circunstâncias em que o apoio tanto financeiro e técnico era partilhado com outros atores. O primeiro que eu recebia, que era responsável por campo de distribuir esses recursos, são as organizações de pessoas com deficiência. E esses já eram os nossos melhores interlocutores. E, na verdade, é uma filosofia de intervenção que tem como princípio a lógica de que as pessoas com deficiência, elas é que devem demandar, elas é que devem fazer, puxar pelas mudanças que elas querem ver. Por fim, só uma observação que, na verdade, veio à cabeça com a introdução do colega em relação aos financiamentos, e isto é uma experiência, mais uma vez, do Sul Global, é que, devido a vários fatores, mas às vezes os recursos podem ser uma malícia, no sentido em que quando encontram instituições não fortificadas, não sólidas, okay? Que muitas vezes ainda estão à procura de uma identidade própria, pode contribuir para o enfraquecimento destas instituições. E vejo isso principalmente na indústria do desenvolvimento, porque você tem organizações internacionais que estão constantemente a contactar para ser o parceiro, para submeter uma proposta ali, lá, e você passa a vida a dançar de um lado, né, com o outro parceiro, às vezes já fazer coisas que não têm nada a ver com umas com as outras. E tem ganho de curto prazo, eventualmente você vai receber uma pequena porção daquele bolo, mas em termos de constituição, em termos de consolidação e solidificação institucional, não podemos. Depois não se sabe muito bem o que é que as organizações estão fazendo. Só queria para te dar isto.
Thank you. Yes. So just in addition to some of the examples that Rannveig and Jorge have already given in response to Anne's question about beyond law and policy. I think it's very easy for us to focus on law and policy because we're working with law and policy very much in this programme. But practices are just as important, and products, and these can take all sorts of shapes and forms. And so practices might be the practices of researchers, the practices of activists, the practices of governments, doctors, engineers, all sorts of things. So there's a huge range of practices which are really important and feed into social change, social change. And products, so within disability studies, and I think this was touched on earlier, it's not just the social sciences and law that are involved. There are also people from very arts-based backgrounds, people who are from engineering and technical backgrounds, and we've got a project going on at the moment in Leeds which involves it's a multidisciplinary project. Mark just mentioned in the last session about the design of clothing that's designed to help people who are deaf-blind navigate. Various haptic things. So it involves people working on robotics, sociologists, transport studies people, and various other disciplines as well. So it's very much a multidisciplinary thing, drawing on the techniques of disability studies based on nothing about it without its involvement into bringing it into design processes. The question about working with governments, I think that just totally endorses everything that's been said already. And I think because the focus of this particular workshop was on working with disabled people's organisations and civil society, we haven't mentioned so much about that. And I really echo Rannveig's point about even when we do that, not leaving disabled people's organisations out, with them as well. And then the first question about Horizon 2020 and the involvement of patients' organisations. That's interesting. I haven't been following Horizon 2020 so carefully because of all the things beginning with B happening in the UK at the moment. But I think I don't know whether that requirement also extends to disabled people's organisations. That's what's pushing hard for if it doesn't. Beyond specific impact groups. And also the question about research on the effect move towards a more digital environment has on employment. That's such a big issue, and I think there is a lot of research going on already around the changing nature of work and the implications that that's going to have on society generally. But I'm not sure how much there is specifically on disabled people within that topic with multiple sclerosis in particular. But other people in the room might know more. I think Mark and Lisa are more involved in the research side.
Thank you. Então, vamos para esta sessão. Houve uma coisa que foi dita aqui, mas que foi a Rannveig, que eu gostei muito, que é adquirimos este saber e colaboramos com as pessoas. E gostava de realçar a importância que a comunidade, os investigadores na área dos estudos da ciência, têm para os próprios movimentos de pessoas. Nós, sem dados, nós sem informação, nós sem mesmo um enquadramento teórico do que é a deficiência, o que significa, mas o termo de deficiência do ponto de vista no nível individual, mas do ponto de vista social, aquilo que é o seu enquadramento na sociedade, aquilo que a sociedade significa para as pessoas com deficiência, de se haver um enquadramento teórico consistente. Não há movimento de pessoas com deficiência que seja eficaz na produção das mudanças sociais que são necessárias. E isto é uma pena, mas em Portugal os investigadores que se dedicam a esta área são muito poucos. contam-se pelos dedos, não se calhar. Os investigadores, sérios que estão a dedicar a esta área, cabem, não cabem, mas temos com nós. E isso é pena, e eu fazia um apelo a que haja mais gente a entrar em documentos nesta área, a fazer carreira académica nesta área, porque fazem-nos falta para a atividade que nós temos para o ativismo das pessoas. Nós estamos no Centro de Vida Independente, já convidámos a Paula e já convidámos o Filipe Fontes para pertencer a um seio estratégico, porque queremos ter uma intervenção que se baseie também na evidência científica e naquilo que é o saber também científico. Nós temos a vida, temos a experiência, temos isso tudo, mas faz-nos falta. Foi por isso que eu comecei, foi o meu caráter utilitário da relação com a terapia que eu iria exprimir-vos, mas pronto, é nesse sentido que nos faz a grande falta.